if you can reframe those moments of chaos when you go, uh-oh, we're really getting off topic here, as where's the creative energy taking me and how can I ride that like a surfer rides a wave, still getting down, getting back to the beach, right? I just don't want to get to the shoreline, but can I reframe that as an opportunity rather than as an obstacle? And maybe the newness and purpose can be a useful way of doing it.
Hello and welcome to the Human Restoration Project podcast. My name is Nick Covington. Before we get started, I wanted to let you know that this episode is brought to you by our supporters, three of whom are Leah Kelly, Brandon Peters, and Simeon Frang. Thank you so much for your ongoing support. We're proud to have hosted hundreds of hours of incredible ad-free conversations over the years. So if you haven't yet, consider liking and leaving a review in your podcast app to help us reach more listeners. And of course, you can learn more about Human Restoration Project on our website, humanrestorationproject.org, and connect with us everywhere on social media. How do you define creativity? Would you be able to spot creativity in the wild? What about creativity in the classroom? This endless human quest to define the seemingly undefinable and somehow make it useful for educators is what today's guests Tom Rendon and Zachary Stier set out to do, bringing together philosophy, neuroscience, and site visits in a years-long collaboration that became Creativity in Young Children, What Science Tells Us and Our Hearts Know. And in this conversation, Tom and Zach help me understand the counterintuitive ways creativity often shows up in the world, in the human condition, and how we can cultivate creativity and connection in the classroom.
Thanks so much, Nick, for having us on the show. Love your podcast. Love what you're doing with the human restoration stuff. And so thanks for having us on. So I am basically an author and consultant focusing on early childhood education. I have this book, and then there was an earlier book I wrote with Gay Groundland called Saving Play, about addressing standards through play-based learning in preschool and kindergarten. Written several other articles and resources and chapters and books relating to an emphasis really on early childhood systems, governance, collaboration efforts, social emotional development, and equity. So I also consult with 2 national Head Start technical centers and also had consulted with the Pyramid Model Consortium. And before that, I was the Head Start State Collaboration Office Coordinator at the Iowa Department of Education for about 18 years. So,
hi, my name's Zach Stier, and as Tom said, we're really excited to be on this podcast. For almost 14 years, I've been the children's librarian here at Erickson Public Library in Boone, which is really exciting because 1/3 of our entire building, we have 3 stories, is dedicated to children and families. So I get to come to a little kingdom every day, as I like to say, that I get to be responsible for. And I also teach part-time at the University of Illinois. It's called the iSchool, which is really dedicated for future librarians. So I teach 2 courses there throughout the year in early literacy, and I developed a course on public library partnerships. I also have authored, several articles. Area of research, obviously, creativity is a big one. Public library partnerships, family engagement, early literacy. And most recently, authored my first picture book, which I'm pretty excited about. So yeah, just try to dip my toe into as much stuff as I can.
You've got a lot of irons in the fire there,
Yeah.
Staying busy. Maybe a random side note, but I know my kids just went back to school. A lot of the metro areas did. Maybe they did up there in Boone too. But I imagine you're kind of transitioning out of like the summer programming, the busy season for libraries. Is that? Am I getting that more or less, or?
Yeah, we do, you're absolutely right. I always tell folks we do 11 months worth of programming and we take 1 month to transition. That is August. So I know in the month of June, we did 84 programs for children through adults, and July we haven't even counted, but we're always active. August, again, is my time to connect and reconnect with our partners at the schools. We do outreach programming throughout the year, and then, we'll hit the ground running So I would say on average every week, even in the fall, we're averaging between 5 to 8 programs, which is great. So we're busy, which we love.
Yeah, and as one of those parents over the summer in
Yeah,
particular, but all the time, who, uses the library as, I mean, a resource, a reprieve, from either spending a lot of money on in a consumer space,
sure.
and just a reprieve from the heat to get in there and do something a little bit more connective and a little bit more intellectual. I'm always appreciative of that.
Yeah, and the last thing I'll say is from an equitable sense, no, none of our programs cost money. So we're able to provide, all households, wherever you come from, some really cool stuff. Our kickoff carnival, we do that in June. The first Monday in June, we bring about 50 or so community partners, and we line up like 2 blocks worth of activities. I think this year we were around 1,400 people that attended that. So it was good. And then we're like, oh, we have 8 more weeks of programming. So
Onward and upward, I guess.
yeah,
Never,
yeah, we love it. It's good. It's good energy. It's a good reason to be tired. So
Well, that honestly kind of brings into like where I wanted to set the stage with this conversation is like here you are, two very different backgrounds converging on this issue. The book is Creativity in Young Children, What Science Tells Us and Our Hearts Know, of which, of course, y'all are both co-authors of this. So what even led you two to come from the realm of, library sciences and then Tom, with your background and head start, to say, let's partner on a book and make that book about creativity in young kids?
well, I'll jump in here. Tom and I were actually reminiscing a little bit about this because I think it's been 4 years, maybe even five,
5 years,
since
yeah.
we, connected. Tom and I did a presentation early on the subject of creativity. It was very well received. But I reached out to him, as with his background and knowing also that he had authored a book specifically on play and had this request and said, do we want to write a book on creativity? um, and I'll talk more about this later, but for me, I was coming from a space of not only that previous presentation, but also how much creativity has been such an important part of me as an individual and as a professional, and wanting to really devote strong, attention to an area that, while we know that it's celebrated and know that folks are, participating in creativity, we want to make sure that it has more attention.
Yeah, I'll just add a couple points of one really, I think, important point is that we didn't come at this as sort of creativity experts. We really started to dig into this topic, and the topic had been broached by Zach when he came up to me, and so when we did the presentation, I thought, oh, this is really interesting. And so that really, and then we had a great conversation about it. So I thought, yeah, there's not only is this an interesting topic, but people are interested in talking about it. And so then we spent a lot of time sort of beginning a journey on what is creativity and what is it about, and wanting to try to take out of our minds any preconceptions we had about creativity and just dig into what in fact people were saying about it, what experts said. So we read a ton of research. We interviewed a bunch of creativity experts and talked to them. We did some field trips out to child care centers and Head Start programs and libraries, and tried to sort of see where we saw creativity playing itself out. And so the book really is a recording of that journey, that of what we discovered and what we found out about it. Uh, and I really think that we just scratched the surface of the implications. Because they were all new to us, and so we're like going, well, there's this, here's some things we think it could mean, and there's certainly plenty of ideas and things that we think people could do, and things that the implications of what we found reveal. But I also think it really opens a door that I hope other people will come through and say, well, if that's true about creativity, then maybe this is what I should be doing in my classroom, or this is what my library should be doing, or wherever else we connect with the task of educating society.
And I think that approach really came across in the book, that the idea that this was a journey or an exploration, like you both bringing your backgrounds and perspectives to bear on this question. And right, like I think of creativity as an amorphous thing. How do you pin down or define creativity? It seems almost to be like everything and nothing at the same time. Everybody wants it. We're not all sure how to achieve it. And that's one thing that you touch on really early on in the book, are those various definitions. I wonder if you could describe some of the different definitions of creativity that you found as you looked in the literature and talked to experts, and maybe discuss the one that you eventually nailed down as being, this is going to be the working definition that we'll at least use for the duration of this book.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of them. Some of them, I think, there's some very poetic ones. I just want to read a couple of them because I think they're provocative. At least we thought they were. Well, we all know about Vygotsky, right? He's a well-known theorist. Any human act that gives rise to something new is referred to as a creative act. So this idea of newness comes in. Creativity is using our imagination to come up with ideas or to make something new. There was a great sign outside the Iowa Science Center, and it was this: creativity is intelligence having fun, which I found very provocative. Or we listened to this. There's a creativity researcher from University of Iowa. I don't think she's teaching anymore, but Nancy Andreasen, and she's quoting William Blake here, a poem from "To see the world in a grain of sand and heaven in a wild flower, hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour." So all these sort of paradoxes and weird combinations. And to get to the second part of your question, I think what we nailed down to have something that was, not just evocative or poetic, but something that we could actually analyze a little more carefully, was a formula that shows up in a number of different researchers that we looked at, and that's this idea of newness plus purpose, or originality plus utility. I mean, you could put it together any different way, and the idea is that for something to be creative, it has to somehow have a newness quality to it. I think that you've certainly heard that in all of that. Something that sort of strikes us like, well, I never heard that before, or that's a new way to look at it. But also somehow that has to be tethered to some functionality, even if the functionality is just to sit back and enjoy it and go, oh, that's groovy. I love that. That's cool. That's not without value, but if it's just complete nonsense and just doesn't make any sense or fulfill any purpose, can it really be creativity? And so I think I remember asking this of a workshop we did at one of NACY's, the National Association for the Education of Young Children's conferences, and somebody actually pushed back and said, well, why can't it be purposeless? And I said, well, I didn't really want to have a knockdown, drag out fight there, but people really want to push that edge of the definition. And I'm saying, like, okay, that's fine, because there was a definition of play we used in our playbook which is apparently purposeless. Not really purposeless, but play has this sort of, I'm not going to make money off of this thing, or I'm not going to solve world hunger with this creative exercise, but I'm just going to play with it. So we think that having both of those is a kind of polarity, by which I mean that we're asking them to fit together, but what happens is they kind of orbit one another. So one can't drift too far apart without having to get pulled back by the force of the other. And so holding those two things in tension proved to us to be a really useful way to apply creativity to a lot of different situations.
Tom and I have known each other for over a decade. specific to the book, I don't know if he remembers two things. I remember going to a baseball game with him. He took me to a I-Cubs game. And afterwards, we were just talking about a whole bunch of stuff, and Mr. Rogers, Fred Rogers, came up. It was one of those moments where I was like, oh, there's somebody that, not only enjoys the neighborhood, but really has invested time to get to understand the philosophy of Fred, and what he offered to the world, especially with children or two children. And so things started to percolate, like, maybe there's an opportunity here for us. And then we did put together a presentation on creativity for a conference. And then, with my background is a public librarian. I'm a children's librarian. I also am an individual with a learning disability. And so I've invested a lot of time in understanding and applying creativity into my work and into my life. And so I remember going to a restaurant with him and started to just have that conversation. What would it be like to write a book on creativity? Creativity is not something that's unknown in the literature. There's plenty of researchers that focus and zero in on that 100%. But what's unique about our approach is Tom's long career focuses on early childhood within a formal learning spaces, and I am an informal educator. And what's unique about that is there's no silo in those two things. There is actually a bridge between both, and that they exist in what we call an ecosystem. And so it was a unique partnership in writing this book because of those unique lived experiences and approaches, and how we wrote our chapters and how we approached questions, answering those questions. And of course, connecting with librarians and early childhood professionals to provide those case studies that are in the book too. So that's sort of a short trajectory and short history of our partnership.
The trauma approach, or I guess the trauma informed perspective on creativity, was so refreshing, I think, because it really spoke, I think, to my experience struggling with these things as sort of like a way of not being able to see the future or not to think of the world in any kind of different way, right? Sort of being trapped by either perceived or real, barriers, emotions, brain chemistries. And part of, I guess, breaking those cycles is being able to see the world in different ways, and being able to think in new and different ways and break out of cycles and habits that led to places that you didn't want to be. And so I think just recognizing the relationship between those two things was really important in the book as well.
If I
Yeah,
can just
of
piggyback on
course.
that a
Yeah.
little bit. One of the things that you pointed out is I think it's also the connection between creativity and liberation. And I think a lot of liberationists have always felt like the connection between liberation and education, and the importance of introducing people to new ideas that really light their imagination and make them think about a world that could be, whether it's their own world, perhaps, in some kind of dungeon of previous trauma, and thinking about how they can see themselves out of that, to even thinking about what aspirations we might have as a society and where we might want to move with. So I think there's a really key. Um, I just wanted to make that point because what you said suggested that to me, and I hadn't quite thought about it that way, but I think it's really important.
Yeah, I'm wondering, Zach, if even, ahead of the big idea around creativity and trauma is another wonderful section related to creativity and neurodiversity, and really embracing a neurodiversity paradigm of thinking about not just about disability, but of the range of perspectives on any kind of related issue. And you speak very candidly about your experience with special education and being diagnosed with a learning disability. And I'm thinking of that notion of liberation here too. Would you be willing to speak to that, bring that your own experiences into that conversation?
That's a great question. So life is about growth. So I will say this before I answer that in more detail. early on after high school, I held a lot of animosity towards educators that were in my life. But now, as I've grown and really done research and have more lived experiences, I'm going to take it out on the system because at the time that I went to school, I graduated like 20 years ago. Even then, the system, in many ways, people like me, students, kind of fell through the cracks a little bit. I started my educational journey with a learning disability, got diagnosed when I was in, kindergarten. I had to go to occupational therapy and speech therapy, and never once did that obviously bother me. But early on, I was sort of confused as to why this was the placement where my learning started, and the reason is I always knew that I saw the world different and that I took in, my studies differently. And what I mean by that is to accomplish a task or an assignment, many times I would choose an alternative route that was clear, more creative. Especially, let's say, mathematics it's a challenging one for me because one of my disabilities is I have a visual spatial impairment, and really what that means is if somebody were to well, this is a prime example. We got a new desk at the library for in the children's department, and people gave me blueprints of that, and I'm like, I don't get it. I don't see what this is going to look like. But once my director, walked downstairs and put sticky notes down on the ground and told me to walk with her, I got it. And so in school, though, it was always strong advocacy. And I started going to my IEP meetings, sixth grade. And so early on, yeah, I remember sixth grade was a pivotal moment because I really wanted to question, why am I in special education? This is the way I see things. This is the way I want to solve. And it's the system that really says, because of X, Y, and Z, we have to. This is your place here. And so I struggled. One thing people should know about me is I will determine for myself what I can and can't do. I don't like to be told that. So, but through that journey, I learned that yeah, it's great to use those skills of creativity. Storytelling is one of the most important pieces for me in terms of creativity, and I implement those in my daily life, both my personal and my professional. But I want to say one last thing. What it takes, though, is there's a component of creativity, especially for those with disability, that involves advocacy. And I don't think we do enough for self advocacy. I think there's this intimidation because you're advocating to authority, which would be, let's say, a teacher or even the principal or whoever. And even in your adult life, you're advocating maybe to your administration. Um, but there shouldn't be any fear of that because all you're doing is standing up for yourself. And there's a way to do it eloquently, because some people just don't know. People don't understand. So it's about educating them. And so that's why I'll bring back my director. When she came down and put the sticky notes down, I was like, wow, like this individual is understanding that I want to know this. I want to see this. I want to understand. But there is another approach. And that's where the sticky notes came from. And that was very helpful and reassuring that this is a safe space to be, the learner that I am and the person that I am. It really does a good job in my job with kids as well. So thank you for letting me share that.
Thank you so much for sharing that. What I found so powerful, and the reason why the Tom's connection to liberation prompted this for me was, right, you reflecting on how the focus of the system was on what you couldn't do and the things that you were failing at, when it would seem to me that within sort of a way of thinking of creativity, would say, okay, like let's flip the script a little bit here and think, right, outside of that small box of school that we tend to put students in. And really that flips it from like that deficit to that asset thinking too. So part of thinking creatively, geez, not just about problems or of content, right? But thinking creatively about people and their potential. And I appreciate that this conversation has gone immediately from the classroom level to the, the I don't know, the epistemological level about how we know things, about the world. Really just showing the impact of that.
And maybe it's worth pointing out too that one of the premises of the book is really that everyone is creative. There's no such thing as a person who's not creative. And so, starting with that premise, I think sort of opens up the possibility of a super inclusive kind of educational process, because we can tap into everybody's, this ability that everyone has.
One thing that struck me when I was reading through the book, and it's something that I knew, and as it pops up, I continue to be struck by it every time I encounter it, because to me, it just seems really counterintuitive of the way that we think about the structures of schooling versus the structure of the way that brains work. And that was when you guys wrote about the default mode of the brain, right? What it's not doing when it's actively engaged in a problem, and it's filing and sorting things. It's working some things out. It's the reason why we need to take breaks, go on walks. You're not going to solve a problem just by beating your head against the desk over and over again and trying to make it work. And that to me seemed really counterintuitive, again, to the structures and systems of school. And I wonder if you both encountered some things in the course of your research that either you thought were also counterintuitive to your understanding, or things that surprised you along the way.
Well, I want to piggyback a little bit on that, and then I can get to other things that we did. But one of the ideas about this kind of seeing things that it's like, oh yeah, this is new to me, but it also seems familiar. That was a little what we were trying to capture in the subtitle, and so I just wanted to, what science tells us, what our hearts know. There's this echo of confirmation that happens, as well as another thing we think creativity does, and that's a sort of head-heart uniting. That we're not just talking about intellectual space, but we're talking about emotional space and affective engagement. So that's just a really important idea about the book. So I wanted to connect it back with that. But I think some other perhaps counterintuitive ideas was maybe the first one about creativity being a life force. And this was it was a complete accident. Let me just tell you really quickly the story about how this came about, because I think it says a lot about our process, but it also says a lot about creativity itself. And that is, I was making the initial connection pretty early on in the research of the book between creativity and constructivist ideas around education, which simply put is that children construct the knowledge that they retain. They have to make it their own at some level, in some way. Even rote learning, it has to be drilled into you, because you're having to force your brain to make it very similar to what the outside is like. So that whole idea of constructivism I thought was really important. I said, well, then clearly Piaget must have a lot to say about creativity. That was my thinking. So then I got there's an enormous book that you can get out there, which is like a huge collection of Piaget's writing. And so I got this book and started to look through it around, well, what does he say about creativity? And there was very little that actually used that word. But the one place that I did see it in there was his reflections on this well-known philosopher at the time, not so well known now, of Henri Bergson, the turn of the century in France. And he had written a book called Creative Evolution. I think we talk about it in the book. I think it's called Creative Evolution. And so I thought, well, let me go and look at that book and see what Henri Bergson's writing about. And so when we dug into that, basically what Bergson was saying in this book was he was pushing back against what sort of the post-Darwinists were saying, which was that if evolution is correct the way Darwin talked about it, then it's very mechanistic and it's leading to one place, right? That's, there's sort of a teleological part of it, but then there's also a really sort of pragmatic or mechanistic part of it. And he said, I don't think that captures what's really going on. That seems too deterministic. It doesn't seem to me what's really happening, because Bergson was a biologist, as was Piaget originally. Piaget did most of his studying in biology. So what Bergson says is that what creates evolution to happen is this sort of creative process by which something new emerges from the pressures and forces that happen. And there's a revitalizing force that's going on, that's driving each single step of evolution. That's what he's saying. Well, I love the French word he uses is élan vital, and which of course we directly translate as life force. And so when we started looking at that, then it just sort of like, oh my God, this really has huge implications, I think, for how to think about creativity. First of all, that life itself is a creative process. Thinking about that, and I could spend a whole thing around how religion that incorporates a god, typically that god is a creator, or one of the gods is a creator. So right there we have this sort of divine vocation that's specifically mixed in. So life is a creative process. Creativity is central to life because the evolutionary process is something that's happening all the time. I think the final big aha for me in that was that creativity is a life force that pushes development forward. And when they talk about development, that immediately made me, as an early childhood person, go back into child development and go, to what extent is creativity actually driving what we call child development? And in fact, we have a whole section in the book that makes this whole connection between child development and creativity. And then we go back and look at some of the early childhood pioneers like Maria Montessori and Piaget and Vygotsky and others. And then where do they talk about creativity? How do they talk about creativity? And finding that it's really there at a very fundamental level in terms of the way they talk. So that was one idea that I thought seemed really new. I'd never read about it anywhere else before, never heard anybody make this connection in anything that we had read, but it seemed like maybe we were onto something. So I wanted to put it out there kind of early in the book so that it could be in the back of people's minds as they think about some of the other big ideas that we explore.
There's honestly such a natural connection there too, between perhaps what Bergson was writing about over 100 years ago and then what we know about the neuroscience today. I mean, it's the reason why like sapiens is in the Homo sapiens. We can't help but think and create and construct. Like, you can't ever turn the brain off. It's always thinking and building and learning. And like, so to call it, I think on the one hand, like the life force in a more philosophical context, and then to understand it as like it just what brains do, right? At least it's what human brains do at the biological level.
What
Like
life does.
Yes, yeah. Oh, that's such a great point. Such a great way to bring those two things together. Zach, how about for you? What did you find in this that seemed counterintuitive or surprising or unlocked sort of the key for you?
We have in this book early on, there is a chapter, it talks about what is creativity, and we have a lot of quotes. And one that always sticks out at me, I'm going to read it here. It's Arthur Koestler, and it's, quote, creative activity is a type of learning process where the teacher and pupil are located in the same individual. I found that was sort of the thesis of and sort of the catalyst for me, that quote. I mean, we have many amazing scholars in this book we reference, but why I like that is to remind ourselves that there's no silo, like that while this person has a role of a teacher and this person has the role of a pupil, we all share those roles regardless of age, time, all of that. And it reminds me that we need to ensure that we take very seriously that we're never going to stop learning, never going to stop experiencing, never stop connecting. And that to me just really elevated and reassured me that yes, this is important work. But the question that I was raised is, or thinking throughout, is when do individuals stop? Maybe not stop, but just begin this trail in another direction where now we want to focus on making sure we get the top grades, or we want to make sure that we get the right test scores, and we're really looking at proficiency in that way. Now, of course, I'm not saying that that's not needed. We have to ensure children are, you know, uh, accomplishing certain milestones in their learning and in their development. I mean, that's critical. But along the way, especially with creativity and implementing that creativity, is proficiency isn't about necessarily only how many words you can memorize, how fast you can do factors of math, but it where in that space does the teacher then become the pupil and reverse that role and say, what are ways that we're teaching this? Is there a differentiated pathway in the event that there are children that may not um, align specifically with this curriculum, get to the same result, but maybe there's a different pathway? And that's what to me was very critical in writing this, is that there are many different pathways. I'm actually experiencing this with my niece who's 11, who's asking me some help on sixth grade math. Now, even as a person with a doctorate, and I love statistics, that's my area, more qualitative statistics because I'm a storyteller. It was interesting because we're totally different generations, and how things are being taught obviously can be different. So when I took my approach, there was a lot of confusion on her end and some frustration because it's like, this is how I'm taught to do this. So took that and implemented what we're talking in this book of, what about other ways of doing things? We get to the same result, but here's another pathway. And it's interesting how some are now programmed to say, this is the path, this is the one path. And I struggle with that. We need to be okay with different pathways, different approaches, and that it's important as an educator, and whether it be a librarian or early childhood, to take the initiative to pause and say, what does a would a child how would a child experience this? And it's hard sometimes to kind of get into that mindset. And what can I do to offer those aha moments of excitement? Because again, if we're just setting things up and saying, complete this, and this is the formula or the process or whatever, this is it, then there can be some challenges there. And I want to be very clear, like, obviously there are some things that, yeah, we need to make sure that children are accomplishing milestone moments developmentally, and I get that. But to me, in writing this book, it's experiencing those aha moments and understanding the different pathways of learning was really critical. And then finally, I'll say one thing that I was really excited, and what Tom and I talked a lot about, was one, making sure that we study creativity within the lens of neurodiversity, autism, looking at that research, because again, it lends itself to this understanding of how individuals see the world, experience the world, different pathways, brain, neurological development. But then we had a great conversation of, we need to have a chapter on creativity and trauma. Because again, I keep reiterating lived experiences. Obviously, we want to ensure that they're positive, but how does trauma affect creativity, and how does it can it affect perspective? And that trauma is not linear, and that there's not. It's really challenging to have one defined definition of trauma, because circumstances, experiences can vary. And so what you may see as traumatic, maybe somebody else doesn't see that as traumatic, but it still has an impact on the child. So those are some of my surprising moments in writing this book and really looking through that discovery. And I will say we also, and I think I said this, we also spent some time at sites, really seeing creativity come to life, which was really exciting.
One of the reasons I was really excited to talk to both of you is because you performed a number of site visits alongside your own commentary and sort of how these places of learning, some of them were schools, preschools, as you had mentioned, Zach, sort of pre-K through older grades as well, and applying what you had learned in your research about creativity to these models. And so I'm so curious for you to share with listeners what you saw in there, what the present model of teaching and learning in those contexts gets right as it relates to what you found, and what is it missing at the same time.
I left those sites. I'm going to first start talking about the educator sites, the early childhood sites. And I was like, I wish I went to school there because it was, I will say this early on in my education, my folks put me in a Montessori school. But, things happen financially, and they just had to put us into public education rock stars that they are. We have to celebrate our public educators. So that's neither here nor anywhere. And they, early on, I will say this, did provide a really good space for creativity in my learning. But when I left these, I was like, it's the system that has changed, that this is so foundational, and the excitement of kids, in different centers that they were doing. One site blew me away because she's introducing them to artists like Andy Warhol, uh, maybe even Picasso, like all sorts of, and not that that's like affluent or anything like that. Why that was astonishing to me is, wow, these children are being exposed as early as possible to creative thinkers and individuals that have saw the world differently and probably experienced some really strong challenges because of their creative viewpoint. And the other thing I loved is the connection to family engagement with creativity and involving parents and caregivers within that process. So looking at it within the lens of the system approach that, and this other realization that while we like to say that the focus is should be on our kids, which is good, I like to flip that and say that kids have a space at the table too, and that we need to listen to them through this creative endeavor that they're going through and listen to their questions. Inquiry is a huge part. Now, as a public librarian, as a children's librarian, we went to a few sites there too. And, it's sort of probably what Tom faced in that, it's like I know a lot of, what's in the classroom. But for me, what I loved in seeing with these children's librarians is their excitement and the connection between parent, child, and allowing that free space and free play. This metamorphosis of libraries was huge, and it was great to see it in others. And what I mean by that is that books are still to be celebrated, and that space for learning is to be celebrated, but it's a space of learning that is a metamorphosis, that's evolved to be an emphasis strongly on play, and that this approach of a library being quiet, not necessarily all the time because kids are there, and allowing this freedom for kids to be kids. That's one of the biggest things that I will say as a librarian, that I reiterate, that we we want the noise of children, the excitement of play, whether it be with puppets or train tables or Legos or whatever it might be, this imaginative time, Fred Rogers had said, play is the work of childhood, and he's absolutely correct. It is their job, and it's our job to ensure that that's um, nurtured. So those are some of the key highlights in venturing out. And Tom and I was very clear. We were very clear with each other that while we want to ensure there's foundational work, research, uh, connection to theorists, all of that, because we have to. We made it very clear that we have to showcase this work. It's great to reference work, but it's extremely important that we elevate it by showcasing how this work is being applied, which is great.
I mean, all of that is true. I'm going to sort of flip it to the other part of your question around sort of existing models. And part of what you could ask us is, what did we not see? And we specifically were looking for, in some cases, there were special events that were happening, but in other cases, it was more closer to a typical day. There was like a parent-child event that was taking place at one of the elementary. It was an open house for parents that was taking place. So that obviously had a lot of different things for kids to engage with and to do things with, and so that was a little bit different. But we didn't see a lot of emphasis on rote learning or preparation for standardized tests. And I want to say I am not an opponent of standards. If you read the first book we did on saving play, it was really all about taking standards very seriously, but just not making the standards the enemy of play, but rather making them a partner with play, and how that's actually possible. So I think they can really play a role. But to me, as the experiences or the examples that Zach was saying show, if we can leverage creativity as a key part of the education experience, and if you think about like maybe a typical scenario where a teacher is trying to communicate something to students, and the students are not always paying attention, or they're thinking about something else, or they're engaged in some other activity, and the teacher wants to bring them all back to focus so they can communicate that. That's sort of working against the natural creative flow and life force, if that's what it is. And I'm not saying teachers should never do that, because I don't think you can avoid doing that. But you got to understand how that's not leveraging creativity, that's working against it. And is there any part of the day in which you can actually leverage those internal cognitive processes that are going on that would be more akin to creativity, or giving those opportunities for default mode, as you were alluding to earlier? So I think we saw a lot of that, but always, I think if there's a message in the book, it's how do we make creativity more front and center, more central to that, more part of every engagement that happens. And even in the places where we saw it happening, you could think, well, if it's happening there, how can we make that happen more during the day, or in deeper ways during the course of the day?
One thing that I thought really captured what you're speaking to, Tom, about standards not getting in the way, standards supporting them, not squashing creativity or play or anything else, is the exercise that you guys document from Moore Elementary, the kindergarten, where kids are listing those questions. And I just got this big ear-to-ear grin as I was reading the questions that these kindergartners generated under creativity, or for I wonder, how long have alligators been around? How long has the earth been around? How long have humans been? Noticing like kind of connections upon, these things of like age and time. And then, oh, how long has Moore Elementary been here? Someone chimes in, what do ants eat? How long does it take to go from Des Moines to Las Vegas? What's the oldest dino? How long have Komodo dragons been around? Why do turtles move slow? So now we're connecting reptiles, How does the moon float in space? Do all living things have blood? Why does ice fall from clouds? Why are oranges so juicy? How long does it take to learn to read? How long is a giraffe's neck? And when I saw that list, your comment about the standards prompted, because every single question in there is a curriculum in its own right? Like
Absolutely. Yeah.
pull one of those stickies down off the board and say, we're going to spend some time this morning thinking about why are oranges so juicy, right? Every kid gets a clementine or whatever. Let's pull that sucker open and talk about, I don't know, fruits and vegetables and agriculture and everything else. The next day, all right, let's pull another one off here. Oh, do all living things have blood? You can talk about, what does it mean for things to be alive? Is grass alive? You can talk about abiotic and all the other science things. You can talk about time and gravity, right? Like there is a curriculum built into creativity and these kids' questions. I get so flustered and frustrated when people think of these as being at odds, when maybe they're just not thinking creatively enough about the kinds of questions kids are asking. Now it's a soapbox, but I'll give you guys a chance to respond here.
Yeah, I don't think there's any such thing as creativity without non sequiturs, that's what that thing is, a whole string of non sequiturs. But no, I think you're absolutely right. And in some ways, what I was thinking about when I was listening to you was actually a point that was made by Nawal Quiruni, who did a presentation at your Restore Humanity conference that I attended last month. And she had this. She was talking about family engagement and the wide spectrum of family engagement, which I really think is important part. That's really what the whole chapter on formal and informal education is. Not only that education is taking place in both those places, but why can't they kind of cooperate a little bit? Why can't those educational experiences somehow flow from one to the other more naturally, or not be in silos, as Zach was pointing out? And I think his library is a great example of trying to really break down those barriers. But I'm getting a little bit off on what Nawal was saying. But one of her points was this idea of meaning making and how knowledge is created in both of those spaces. And a lot of it just comes from that outside stimulation. So in some ways, teachers should look at that list and go, look how that teacher stimulated all this thinking, because they weren't just thinking about, they were building on each other's ideas, as you were pointing out, but somehow somebody told them about dinosaurs at some point, or they remember somebody gave them an orange or a mandarin, and that got them going. So that outside stimulation is critically important. So even though we talk about creativity as being a very individual task, it deeply relies on external inputs, which is where I think teachers are centrally important. And that kind of leads me to the final point I wanted to make in connection with that. And that was actually in part a comment that Angela Stockman made also at your conference. I love this quote that I had pulled out from my notes there. And that is, when we write about what happens, we give it dignity. What I loved about that presentation is that she was really asking us to be observant and to think about all the ways in which we could capture what we observe, because our observations are so rich and so necessary prior to anything else that happens. And that really is something we're saying is, if you really want to nurture creativity in the classroom, you got to pay attention to how children are already being creative, and then say, how can I be midwife to those processes that are coming true? And I thought she had 1,000. Her presentation just blew my mind of all the different ways. And that your phone not only can take notes, but it can record things, it can take pictures, it can take video. There's just all of those different ways in which you can actually slow life down a little bit to study it enough to see where those creative processes are present.
I had mentioned at the top of the episode, it was back to school for my kids this week, and for a lot of, maybe all of Iowa schools. For any educators, parents, school leaders who are listening to this and they want to take steps to kick off their classrooms in a creative way, or things that they can do to encourage or cultivate creativity in their kids and in their learning spaces, what in your mind is like the one thing that they could do, the takeaway that they could leave this conversation with?
I want individuals, educators, families, whoever these are, to recognize that creativity is everywhere. That there's not a magic formula, or that to obtain a creative space you have to spend X amount of money. That creativity exists all around us. So be inspired. I tell this all the time. Be inspired to look around and to um, encourage conversation, but through the observation. Let's take nature, for example, by looking at snow that might be coming, or leaves, or whatever it might be, generating conversation that then can generate an activity that's creative, you know, either outdoors or indoors. Looking around your house for supplies that you might have, cardboard boxes or whatever recycled material, and know that those can become a drum or a guitar or something like that. And that to me is inspiring. We do need to celebrate technology, and especially the changingness of things like AI. I mean, I'm not going to say that those are not important, but the very basic, very level creativity exists without having, the need necessarily for a device or to spend a lot of money. That the tools are right there. It's just really being more intentional and aware of what they are and taking the time to do so. This busyness, I understand, especially with activities going on in school. And I'll say, go to your public library, to really help, connect and support that learning. So, and if, I'm assuming educators obviously listen to this podcast, and I'll say this to them. If you don't have a partnership with your public library, I encourage you to do that. I visit the schools multiple times a month, and I couldn't do it without the amazing partnerships that we have with the Boone Public and parochial schools here in town.
Well, I think my suggestion, I mean, just to be really practical, is to go to pages 102 and 103, and we have a list of 10 educator behaviors that encourage creativity, and pick one and go do it. We got this list from Keith Sawyer, who's a pretty well-known creativity researcher and writer. He wrote a really great book, by the way, I'll just plug, called The Creative Classroom. It's really more for K-12. And so his actual list is 19 behaviors. We kind of boil them down to 10 because some of that stuff wasn't age developmentally made sense for our audience. But you certainly can look at that and just think about how you can implement that. I would just maybe kind of end a little bit with what I was saying before about our originality plus usefulness formula, and thinking about that as a polarity that's present at every moment, and ask ourselves, so how can we make this newer, or how can we make it different or more original than it used to be? And that's counterintuitive for somebody who's planned really careful lessons. But I will tell you that I have never planned a lesson that ever came out the way I planned it. Never. So what is that telling me? Is that even if I just wanted to do a skeleton, that's all I'm going to have to use anyway, because it's all I'm going to be allowed to use, given the sheer variety of reality that comes in and takes you off in a kind of different direction. So thinking if you can reframe those moments of chaos when you go, uh-oh, we're really getting off topic here, as where's the creative energy taking me, and how can I ride that like a surfer rides a wave, still getting down, getting back to the beach, right? I just don't want to get to the shoreline, but can I reframe that as an opportunity rather than as an obstacle? And maybe the newness and purpose can be a useful way of doing it.
The book is Creativity in Young Children: What Science Tells Us and Our Hearts Know. Thank you so much for capturing your years-long journey in this book, and then, of course, taking the time to talk with me and the audience about it today, Tom and Zach.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Nick. It was great.
Thank you again for listening to our podcast at Human Restoration Project. I hope this conversation leaves you inspired and ready to start making change. If you enjoyed listening, please consider leaving us a review on your favorite podcast player. Plus, find a whole host of free resources, writings, and other podcasts all for free on our website, humanrestorationproject.org. Thank you.